Hey, hey.
Hey there. How you doing today?
Good. Just a heads up, I am live right now, so they can hear you. Well,
Okay,
if
yeah,
anyone.
I am too. So,
All right, cool. Just didn't want to ambush you accidentally.
yeah, I appreciate it. Um, okay, so how you doing this week?
I am doing excellent. Thank you for asking.
All right, I'm doing all right too. So today we got a video essay comparing ancient Athenian democracy to modern American democracy. So, I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on this subject before we get started on that?
Um, I think I'm hoping it's going to go into this is a bit of a tangent, but I hate the whole argument we're not a democracy, we're a republic. I think it's a really dumb argument, especially because the terms as they were understood in that time actually meant much closer to what we mean now. And it's also like it's always used in such a one-sided. Anyways, I hope it goes over that. That's what I hope. That's what I hope it goes over.
Okay, yeah. You hope it goes over the case for like whether we're a republic or not, or why that matters or doesn't matter, or
Yes, I feel like people just say that without any ever actually critically engaging with like the question of like, well, what is better, and what ought we do, and I hope it sort of goes over that because it's really frustrating to constantly deal with like, oh, I think we should be a republic, not a democracy. Why? And it's like, oh, it happen to be that all the democratic stuff happens to really hurt your side politically, just electorally, just happens to really disadvantage you. It's crazy how that works out.
um, yeah. I mean, these things aren't mutually exclusive either, right? I mean, we have voting in America, right? So
Yeah.
in some sense, it's a democracy. I mean, if of course it's certainly a republic, but um, I don't know. I'm ready to get started on it whenever you are.
Yeah, just give me 1 second to get this pulled up. Oh, and I need to stream it as well. Oh, don't want to do that.
Okay.
Oh no, what have I done? Oh, I just really fucked up. Hold on a second.
Vels in chat says, "Is a parliamentary system more democracy or republic?" I mean, I think a parliamentary system is just always a republic, and it can also be a democracy. And it's just depends on how much public involvement there is in it, I guess, whether or not I'd consider it
Okay,
a democracy.
I think I am good to go here.
Cool.
This is a painting of life in ancient Greece, specifically in Athens during its political
Is it possible
golden
to
age.
turn it up a little bit?
Its male citizens enjoyed,
Yeah.
for the first time in the history of a state, near total control over their
Thank
own
you.
political lives. They called their form of government Demokratia. Demos in Greek means people. Kratos means power to do things, which people usually translate as rule. Together, you have Demokratia, the rule of the people. After the fall of Athens, the word democracy wouldn't be linked to another state for more than 2,000 years upon the founding of the United States of America. But the United States created a very different form of democracy that, to many, isn't democratic at all. This video is going to explore these two democracies. We're going to talk about where they came from, what their ideas were, how they're democratic, and also how they're undemocratic. At the end, we're going to circle out and ask if the word democracy is appropriate for either society. So this video is designed to give you a better grasp on the concept of democracy and also how it relates to both societies. So that's the plan, and we're going to begin by looking at Greece. Ancient Greece wasn't a country in the modern sense, with one state and one government. Instead, it was a collection of cities that were their own states, called city-states. These city-states formed over hundreds of years when neighboring families, clans, and tribes joined together for protection. So these city-states were basically just an urban area and the surrounding countryside, all under one sovereign jurisdiction. The most famous city-state, and also the best documented one, was Athens. In 507 BC, the Athenians adopted a system of popular government that lasted nearly 2 centuries, with a brief interruption in 404 BC, when Athens lost to Sparta at the end of the Peloponnesian War. The classical Athenian democracy permanently ended in 321 BC, when Athens was defeated and subjugated by another powerful neighbor, Macedonia. The invention of democracy didn't happen in a vacuum. If you look at the position of Greece on a map, and consider the prominent civilizations at the time, like the Persians, the Egyptians, and the Phoenicians, you can see how it was positioned to be a sort of focal point among the flourishing civilizations at the time, as they interacted, traded, and even fought with one another. So from that came a sort of swirling mixture of genes, cultures, and challenges that shaped Greek civilization and culture. A similar phenomenon continued throughout the Athenian Golden Age, which made Athens a remarkably alive city in its time. It's hard to definitively say more precisely how it happened, since we're talking about ancient history here. But one thing that came to distinguish this flourishing Greek culture was its respect for wisdom. So the Greeks respected wisdom, similarly to how 19th century Americans respected capitalistic enterprise. So the Greeks made their sages into heroes, and had popular sayings like wisdom should be cherished as a means of traveling from youth to old age, for it is more lasting than any other possession. In particular, they were interested in practical wisdom, wisdom that you could make function actively in the world. The Greeks' focus on practical intellectual pursuits led them to develop a new philosophy of rule. You could ask the question of any society, who rules, or where's the highest political authority? The answer to that question for most of history was a person, like a king or a pharaoh. But to the Greeks, these were barbarians. They weren't free, thinking people. The Greeks instead answered the question with law. That, on one hand, was thought to free people. It was thought that getting everyone in society, including its leaders, to be subject to the law, gave people a certain amount of protection in their lives from arbitrary uses of power. It was also thought to have a civilizing effect on people. It was thought that getting people to follow the law made people more driven by reason, and less driven by emotional impulses. Here's how Aristotle put it. Just as man is the best of the animals when completed, which here basically means living in a Greek city-state, when separated from law and adjudication, he is the worst of all. So the Greeks believed that they could civilize all of society, including its leaders, by making everyone in that society subject to the law. So that concept is called rule of law. You don't have to be a democracy to have rule of law. You can have a king, for example, who's also subject to the law. But it's a fundamental aspect of Athenian democracy, as well as American democracy. It's also thought to be a necessary component of democracy more generally. If you think about it, you probably won't be able to rotate out unwanted people by election who are holding office if those people in office are not subject to the law. So rule of law is understood to be a Western idea because the ancient Greeks are understood to be the people who discovered it. Again, we're talking about ancient history here, and the further we go back in time, the less sure we can be about what we know. So we can't say definitively that the Athenians are the ones who invented rule of law, but we are pretty confident.
I was about to ask to pause, but actually he just made the point that I was about to make, which is like, it seems a little bit implausible to me to just uncritically buy into the narrative that's like, these are the people that invented law and civilization and the other people were all barbarians. It seemed for a moment that he was just essentially endorsing that opinion, which seems kind of dubious to me, right? It's just like, that's their cultural narrative about why they're better than the people around them, and every culture has some equivalent to that. Do you have any thoughts so far in the rule of law stuff?
No, I think I think it's all pretty self-evident. He's just sort of giving the historical background, and rule of law is probably pretty important to have a democracy, and the idea that there's equal application of the law. There isn't some sort of like tiered system of the second-class citizens or caste system or anything like that. It seems pretty incompatible with the idea that everyone should have an equal voice in the government.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I think every society that calls itself a democracy actually does have some kind of tiered class or caste system, more or less, though, right? I mean, the ancient Greeks certainly did, right? It was like they literally had slaves living in their society. Women didn't get to vote.
And even in Athens, the people that were allowed to vote were of a very specific class as well.
Right. And then, in modern America, well, we started out having slaves as well. We started out not allowing women to vote. Even today, although we have a very broad body of political participation, we still have other aspects of our society and culture that do kind of like create a tiered system where some people are de facto more subject to the law than others, right?
Yeah, I think it's a question of degrees. Like you can't ever have like a fully, untiered system, but we can still draw distinctions between like, black people aren't allowed to vote versus, might have problems with how the police are held accountable to the law. I think it's a question of degrees, but at a certain point you can draw a line between those degrees where it sort of starts to become not a difference of degrees, but an actual different thing in itself.
Mm-hmm. There's this YouTube video that I saw maybe a couple of years ago, and I think you and I might have talked about this before. I want to say it might be like a CGP Grey video, but it was something about like where do rulers derive their authority from? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Oh, yeah, the CGP keys for rulers.
Oh yeah, that's the one exactly. And so it's kind of like no one person really is the source of their own authority, right? Like if a ruler is able to effectively keep control over a kingdom, it's because they have the support of powerful people around them and so on, right? So I don't know. It's like a little bit weird to say that like the whole concept of like absolute monarchy is like it can really only persist as long as it continues to be supported by some kind of like aristocratic class or broad public support in its own society, and so like in a way like although the legal, like the literal legal structure of the society might be like authoritarian, the power still kind of flows in both directions, right?
Ultimately there still needs to be someone that you have. Yeah, you can't ever truly be self-sufficient. It actually reminds me of some of the differences in the ways that feudalism happened in Western Europe versus like in Russia. And I think there's actually like an academic debate over whether or not Russia even technically experienced feudalism, because in Russia in particular, the control was so absolute, centered at the top, that the czars, could really just do whatever the fuck they wanted. There's a great Kraut video that I'm stealing most of my opinions about this from, that sort of goes over the subject and talking about the history of that sort of as it spans all the way from those times to now. But I still think that there's there are degrees of dependency, but you can never get that degree down to zero, right? You can never truly be a sovereign, unless you're like Superman or something. You can just rule the whole planet on your own, I guess, like Homelander or something. But in the real world, you're always going to be dependent on someone. The question just is, who are you dependent on, and how much of society do they represent? I think is like the key question.
Right. So it's I kind of just think that authoritarian societies and ostensibly democratic societies aren't actually as different as people tend to think that they are. So.
Really? Huh? Why so?
Well, it's partly because of the thing I just said, right? Like, because if you have an authoritarian society, the rulers are effectively ruling so long as they can build a broad enough base of support that they can continue to maintain their power, right? Their power doesn't come from nowhere, it comes from the people below them. And then in ostensibly democratic societies, where we almost always end up picking representatives, people that end up enforcing the law, who act essentially as rulers over us, and the difference is that we just make it explicit that their authority comes from the public, as opposed to it just being. But do you think
but it feels like there's a big difference in the sense of how difficult it is for the public to exercise their authority. In America, there's lots of things politicians don't even attempt to do because they know if they did, people would push back against them in the form of voting against them. Whereas it feels like people are much less willing to rise up against an authoritarian regime, and it knows that, so it's willing to do things that those politicians that are far more beholden to the public would never dream of.
Yeah, I agree. So ostensibly democratic societies, what they have differently is a mechanism built into their legal system to oppose specific powerful people in ways that an absolute monarchy would not have.
Yeah, I just feel like that is such a difference of degrees. It starts to become like a separate phenomenon, because especially when you're talking about the levers of society, that doesn't just exert against those specific people, but then can functionally, right? Like we're seeing this with Disney, right? Disney was not immune to the public because Ron DeSantis is going after them now because he thinks it'll win him big with the public. So it still feels like there are avenues really to get to all aspects of societies. Those specific aspects of societies are just a little bit higher up on the ladder in terms of like the necessary exertion of will, but still much lower than what I'd expect it to be for like an authoritarian society, where if you really do want to change something, it's like revolution time.
Yeah, and but also let me point out that every society has parallel power structures within it besides the government, right? Like maybe they'll have the church and the economy and whatever, and those do offer alternate ways to push back against powerful people and to I don't know, to pull on the levers of power in a different way. But and yeah, I mean, I think you're right when you say that these are two separate phenomena. Like they are distinct from each other in a way. Like there is a spectrum of societies that are more and less authoritarian. I don't mean to say that there's no difference at all between them. I just think like the difference between them is perceived as bigger than it is because each society kind of valorizes their own way of doing things.
No, I see what you mean. I think I actually do agree. Okay.
All right. That's all I got for now.
Is a Greek invention, and it certainly paved the way for the Athenian democracy that followed. Another major conceptual development that led to democracy is captured in the Greek word isonomia, which translates to equality for all under the law. So you can think of democracy as a manifested expression of isonomia, an expression of political equality in a state with rule of law. But how did this come about? How did this become a thing? For one, rule of law is naturally somewhat equalizing. It brings people of all classes politically closer together. It's humbling towards those at the top and elevating towards those at the bottom. So once you have rule of law, calls for political equality might not be far behind. But we think the main reason why political equality emerged as a popular concept in Greece, and in its most extreme form in Athens, boils down to Greek military culture. In Greek culture, battle and conquest were glorified. The warriors who won battles brought honor and prestige onto themselves, since armies were needed to defend every city-state against potentially larger opponents. Far more people served in the military than we're used to now. For example, even aristocrats might serve as cavalry, since they were wealthy enough to own horses
Pretty much
and the
all
land that
ancient
was needed to
societies were
support them.
militaristic, though. This doesn't really sound like a plausible explanation for why Greece would be different.
Yeah, I feel like they would need to demonstrate more. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, like all of the same stuff that they're saying about like the warriors brought home glory for their homeland. It's like, well, sure, but that's also true in Egypt, and it's also true in Persia, and it's also true in China.
Yeah, I think the
like,
key question would be, the participation. Is it actually true that Greece had far higher participation in its military by a percentage of its population than these other places? It totally could be. I would need to see that.
Yeah, I don't know.
The point he does make about the broad incorporation of aristocrats, for example, as cavalry is actually a big thing. That remained a really big thing for a long, long time. People, I think, forget that a standing professional army really wasn't a thing in most of the world, and it was the case that like you had to bring your own shit a lot of the time, or finance your own stuff, like buying your own equipment. Ironically, what sort of similar to some of the stuff that's coming out about Russian troops in Ukraine now, was absolutely the case. And I believe it was very common that the only people who could afford horses to be cavalry did end up being aristocrats. I know in Roman history that was a really big thing that happened all the time.
Mm-hmm. So actually, I was about to bring up Rome as another society that was highly militaristic and which started out as a republic and went the opposite direction over the course of its like militaristic time period, right? It became more authoritarian while they were out conquering people.
Yeah, and it's funny, he talks about the military as a means of creating social change. It's actually, a lot of people think it's the same thing with Rome. Part of the reason why Rome turned out to be so despotic is because it was consistently demonstrated that, hey, if you want to get power in Rome, great way to start your political career is by doing a bunch of conquering, by expanding the empire. And then all of a sudden you have all these political actors in contention with each other with access to big armies. There was no civilian control of the military. It was controlled by specific groups, were controlled by specific politicians who became personally loyal to them. That's just a recipe for disaster. And it's a sort of its assessment that I think I agree with. It seems almost obvious, like, oh yeah, if we want to avoid our politicians becoming despotic, maybe don't put them in control of individual armies that they'll go out and make conquests for them and make them personally wealthy. That kind of stuff is famous. I think it's like there's like 3 or 4 times throughout Julius Caesar's career where he promises his soldiers a fuck ton of money. He can't pay it to them then, but says, listen, after this, guys, I'm going to make you so rich. And not like their salary, but like doubling their salary, giving them bonuses on top of that stuff. It's just funny they mentioned that because I think in Rome you see the exact opposite transpire.
Mm-hmm. And then when you get to feudal societies, they're organizing, like, it's almost like their entire society has a military command structure, right? And I don't think anybody's going to argue that those are more democratic than Athens stuff, right? But they're probably as militaristic, if not even more.
If the cavalry prominently served in a battle and won, they'd bring glory onto themselves, and with that, power. So over time, a link developed between military service and political power, the power to administer the state. So that made the composition of armies in ancient Greece inherently political. The types of people serving in armies were positioned to win power. Athenian citizens were the ones who democratically capitalized on that. If you think about Greece, it's notably characterized by islands and the Aegean Sea. You can think of the Aegean Sea as the heart of Greece. Athens became unique in Greece when it used wealth from a silver mine it controlled to take advantage of the Aegean Sea. Between 507 and 480 BCE, they built up a powerful navy. It was the greatest navy the Greek world had ever seen. And who, overwhelmingly, works in an ancient Greek navy? The answer is oarsmen, the people who literally rowed the boats. So you might see where I'm going with this. The next question should be, what type of person worked as an oarsman in this ancient Athenian navy? The answer was poor Greek men. The Greek word for them was thetes. We don't know how many
Okay, so I think this is sort of addressing some of our earlier problems. This is a specific reason why in Athens, specifically, the participation in the military led to this kind of development, because it uniquely was getting poor people involved, whereas others, militaries, might be more predisposed to give that glory and political power to other groups of people. Athens was more likely to give it to poor people. I think that's a decent...
Yeah, that does make sense, because I know a lot of ancient societies had like a soldier class of people.
Yeah, I mean the Spartans famously. I mean that was like their whole society was based around that.
Yeah, well, I think the Spartans actually got like every single man involved in their military, though, didn't they?
Well, but that was it was specifically Spartan males. It wasn't the slaves. The Helots, I think the name was. Yeah, but yeah, no, you're right. I mean the class in the sense of literally everyone.
Right. So then if they're putting in service of their military a bunch of people who are not part of an elite class, then they are effectively granting a type of power to those people that other societies wouldn't have.
And if they're doing it way more than other societies, that actually does make a fair amount of sense.
Yeah, maybe so.
There were living in ancient Athens, but there were presumably quite a lot of them. Athenian literature sometimes refers to them as the masses. Athens also had a land army that was more standard for the time, consisting mostly of hoplites. Hoplites were heavy infantry. They were basically the middle class of Athens, people who were wealthy enough to own shields and weaponry. The important point here is that between the thetes and the hoplites, you have a clear majority of the adult male Athenian population, again in circumstances where war can bring glory and power. In that same period, as you might have guessed, Athens uses its land army and its navy to win a stunning series of victories. Its hoplite army unexpectedly defeats the much larger Persian army in the Battle of Marathon, making them heroes around all of Greece. They also won a string of battles around Greece in 506, but probably the most important victory of all went to the navy in the Battle of Salamis in 480, again defeating the Persians and effectively saving Athens from subjugation, which was reported to have caused the masses to have gained a newfound confidence in themselves, which was directly linked to the Athenian democratic revolution, to the ushering in of isonomia. That revolution is typically thought to have occurred in 3 major phases, 3 major reforms, and each reform is linked to a person. The first reform is linked to a man named Solon. Solon was responding to a class war that was ravaging Athens around 600 BCE. There was a massive wealth disparity between rich and poor, and the government, the army, and the courts were controlled by the wealthy. Many in Athens were deeply in debt and unable to pay it off. So Solon was brought in as a moderate to mediate between the classes and keep Athens from destroying itself. One of his main accomplishments was to convince all Athenians, regardless of class, to obey the law. So he created a new set of laws that were applied, without distinction, to all free men. So he's a good figure to peg the beginning of rule of law on in Athens. Solon also canceled the debts, but probably more importantly for the long run, he politically reorganized Athens. He broke Athens into 4 groups depending on their income, which is where we get Thetes from. Each group was then given a different amount of political privilege. The Thetes were given the fewest political privileges. They were given access to the assembly, which is a voting body, which we'll get to, and they were also given access to the courts. So Thetes could now litigate and serve in the jury. Under Solon, the most powerful political authority was called the Council of the Areopagus, which only the wealthy could serve on, and whose members served for life. The second reform was through a man named Cleisthenes. Cleisthenes was involved in a power struggle around 508 in Athens. There seemed to be simmering anger against elites at the time, which Cleisthenes used against his opponent. He aroused the people to revolt, sweeping him into power and establishing him as a populist dictator. He wanted to break the hold that powerful aristocratic families had over parts of Athens, so he politically reorganizes Athens into 10 tribes, which were further broken into subgroups down to demes. So these demes are essentially local districts. It was through that infrastructure that Athenian citizens would go on to exercise many of their democratic rights. Each tribe could elect members to a newly created Council of 500, which we'll get to, and they could also elect one of 10 generals to lead the military. But under Cleisthenes, you still had the Council of the Areopagus, and Thetes, importantly, couldn't hold public office. The last major reform happened under a man named Pericles. Pericles came from a noble family, which was reported to have descended from Cleisthenes. He lived in the mid-5th century, which was the era of Athenian naval dominance. There were calls for political equality, and Athenian opinion was split into 2 camps. One side believed that elites should govern Athens, and the other believed that the people, the demos, should govern Athens. That again was manifested as a power struggle, this time between Pericles and the eventual historian Thucydides. Pericles won the power struggle by associating himself with the many and the poor, which makes the account Thucydides gave of Pericles perhaps not entirely reliable. But anyway, by allying with the people calling for political equality, Pericles rose to power and became the most influential man in Athens. He then worked with a colleague named Ephialtes to break the power of the Council of the Areopagus, which brought about the golden age of Athenian democracy. So without further delay, here's a description of what that society looked like. You could ask the question of any society, where are policy decisions made? Are they made in a throne room or in a private council somewhere? In democratic Athens, policy decisions were made on a hill not far from the Acropolis called the Pnyx. 10 times a year, the citizens of Athens would come together and meet at the Pnyx. Once there, an issue would be raised, and then a debate would occur. Everyone there would have equal right to participate in that debate, which was the Athenian basis of free speech, called isegoria. Once the issue was sufficiently debated, a vote would be held. The people there would then raise their hands to show their support for a particular position. Whatever side won, a simple majority would become new policy in Athens. What I just described was called, in Athens, the ecclesia, the assembly. The issues raised in the assembly were prepared by the Council of 500, whose members were chosen randomly from the public by lot. Of the two, the assembly was the far more powerful body. The assembly could vote down bills drafted by the council. They could change the bills on the floor. They could send the bill back with instructions for redrafting, or they could replace it with an entirely new one. So the real exercise of sovereign public authority rested directly on the assembly. The citizens gathered on the Pnyx could pass virtually whatever policy they wanted. So the most important policy decisions that had to be made in Athens were made in the assembly, which included foreign policy. So, as you might expect, that led to some dramatic assemblies. In the mid-4th century, for example, Philip of Macedon was marching on Athens. The assembly then had to vote on whether to fight or to try to negotiate. The wrong decision could have meant the fall of Athens and even the destruction of Athenian culture. So this must have been a deeply political society. And considering how long democratic Athens lasted, this must have been a fairly competent public. Speaking to that competence, there were very few elected public officials in this society. Short of a few exceptions, like generals, naval architects, and superintendents of the water supply, all public officials were chosen randomly from the citizenry by lottery. These officials all had their power tightly controlled by the assembly. The highest public officials were the generals. They only served one-year terms and were subject to performance reviews by the public. If their performance was found lacking, they would be dismissed. That being said, they didn't have term limits, so generals like Pericles could be re-elected for life. So the influence of a general over a lifetime could give a sort of continuity of purpose to Athenian politics. But all generals, including Pericles, had no formal power outside of the military. Their only ability to influence public policy rested on their ability to persuade the public. So what we're looking at here is a public that directly and thoroughly has control over its own political affairs, which is what we would now call a direct democracy. The Athenian public also directly expressed their political power through the dikasteria, the people's courts. I think it's worth spending a moment describing what it looked like, because it didn't really resemble modern courts. For one, there were no lawyers in the system. You could hire a speechwriter, but all cases had to be registered and argued by private citizens. There also were no judges. All cases were decided by the jury, and that jury was massive. The average size was around 500 people, big enough to be unbribable, and also big enough to represent public opinion. The jury
Oh, that is not big enough to be unbribable, to be clear. It might have been effective at the time. It's certainly a hedge against bribery. But, oh God, I hope I'm not forgetting this. But in Roman history, there is like big crowds that would get bribed. I mean, arguably Julius Caesar's, one of his biggest things was bribing his whole legion and then later the whole public with massive donations. Although to characterize it as a bribe might be a little unfair. But anyways.
Yeah, definitely not unbribable for a couple of additional reasons I want to point out. One is that if there really is a massive disparity between who's poor and who's wealthy, a wealthy person might be as rich as 500 people. And
yeah, go talk to Crassus, man. That dude was fucking loaded.
And then another thing is you probably don't have to bribe all of them, right? Like, what if you just bribed 100 people, right? That's going to give you such a massive advantage that, I don't know.
Yep.
Jurors were again chosen randomly from the public by lot. That meant that there weren't really any professionals in this system. You could even call it an amateur law system. So legal outcomes could be unpredictable. Speakers could fool the jury by, for example, incorrectly citing laws or distorting history. So those...
Wait, what? Oh, that's so funny, dude. It's like, I think I've described this to you before, but like in the form of high school debate I did, it was the policy, man. If you don't respond to something the opponent says, that's now a matter of record. So you just be like, my fellow Athenians, in the Constitution, it says that anyone even suspected of this crime should be summarily executed. And if they don't respond to that, it's just like, wow, okay, I guess that's true. No one knows any better.
Those were the three main institutions: the Assembly, the Council of 500, and the law courts, all directly controlled and managed by the Athenian public. But who exactly was that public? Who had access to those institutions? Athenians, like all Greeks, saw the world in terms of binaries. You were either man or woman, free or slave, Greek or barbarian, citizen or alien. Within that, the Athenians permitted one half of those binaries into their democracy. They permitted free, male, Greek citizens of Athens. So slaves weren't permitted, women weren't permitted, non-Greeks weren't permitted, and non-Athenian citizens weren't permitted. It's still normal today to exclude non-citizens from your politics. The rest of these exclusions were relatively normal for their time, but I think it's worth spending some time addressing them. The Greeks, again, believed that their city-states civilized people and freed them, so they believed that they lived as free people in their city-states. They also believed that people elsewhere in the world, the barbarians, lived as subjugated people. They lived as subjects to a ruler. So to them, foreigners and slaves were essentially the same, They both had the psychologies of subordinated people. So to the Greeks, their politics were incompatible with both foreigners and slaves. They saw their free politics as being incompatible with the psychologies of subordinated people. Speaking of slaves, the Athenians had quite a lot of them, probably somewhere between 80 and 100,000 slaves, which was about a third of the total Athenian population.
Holy
Athenian
shit.
male citizens wanted to spend their time on things that they thought were valuable, but that don't necessarily create wealth. They wanted to spend their time on things like government, war, literature, or philosophy. But someone has to work to create wealth, and this was before machines were invented, so slaves were the Athenians' answer to that. So the work provided by slaves made it possible for so many Athenian men to spend time in government or to serve in the military. That being said, the Athenians seemed to be relatively generous towards their slaves, in contrast to the United States of America,
Careful.
where slaves and their families were passed down from generation to generation, making their outlook on eventually gaining freedom pretty hopeless. In Athens, it wasn't unusual for well-behaved slaves to be freed as their owners reached the end of their lives. Slaves in Athens.
To be clear, that was also true of certain practices in American slavery at certain periods of time, especially in the North, especially before the cotton gin. This was not that uncommon to happen. I think the thing to say would be that it doesn't matter if you get to be freed on the death of your master. It is still monstrously inhuman. I would hope would be the position to take, but. I'm sure this guy isn't endorsing slavery, but yeah, I don't really think, oh, well, they freed them. Like, yeah, I mean, freeing them at the end of their death is nice, but, like, I think it pales in comparison to still being enslaved for, what is probably going to be most of your life, especially given the fact that, the slave owners probably have a much better, state of health, and are probably going to live have a longer life expectancy than their slaves, most of the time. In fact, it was actually George Washington freed some of his slaves in his will. I believe he's freed his own slaves, but technically his wife, Martha Washington, owed a bunch of the slaves that he owned were technically from her dowry, so it wasn't clear if he had the authority to free them after his death, and also she tried not to free them, and she did eventually free them, although she only freed them when she's got worried that they might, try to kill her or escape while she was asleep. So not the best person. But that's all to say. I don't know if that's really the best thing to be like, guys, they freed the slaves sometimes after the death of the master. That's not really that big of a W.
So if we were to look at a different ancient society that did not have legally instituted slavery, but they did instead just have as all of them did, like a gigantic peasant farmer class where the vast majority of the people in the society live their entire life as farmers on that one plot of land, and even though they are not legally slaves, that they are more or less living in servility to, like, do you see that as a significantly different thing from
Maybe. I think it really depends on, I guess, sort of what we're talking about in this, which is like the state of the legal system. I think I think there are like sufficient, examples of like serfdom or stuff like that, where it is like, this is probably even worse. This is worse than some forms of slavery. But I think the legal owning of a person feels like a really unique bad, even independent of the material conditions of being owned. Like, even if it was the case that, you live a relatively good life, you don't have to do any hard labor, being a slave still feels like a gross moral harm to me in that sense, independent of the material conditions of your life as a slave.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, like, I think it's hard to not look at this with a modern set of values, right?
Yeah.
And like, of course, as you agreed, like the material conditions of a society without slavery back then are probably not drastically different from the material conditions of a society with slavery, from the point of view of the poorest people in it. I'm just wondering, like, how much of a difference do you think? Like, how much do you think they cared that they were legally owned, as opposed to just like effectively living their lives in it as a
Yeah,
subsistence
that's a tough one. I feel like the answer has to be they probably would care a lot less. Probably not. They probably wouldn't. It's probably not the case that they wouldn't care at all. But they probably would. I mean, I gotta imagine they would care a lot less than we do about that kind of thing.
Yeah,
don't
I
see
imagine so because
yeah.
from our point of view, there's a better alternative, right? That
Yeah.
like the non-slave people in in the Americas 200 years ago were living pretty different lives from what the slaves were living. But I think an ancient peasant farmer probably wasn't living that different from a life from an enslaved ancient peasant farmer.
Yeah. Yeah, which I think then the question boils down to if it is the case, excuse me, if it is the case that I view slavery as a unique moral harm independent of the material conditions it imposes, how bad would the conditions have to be of the freed person for me to choose slavery instead?
Uh-huh.
I don't know. That's a tough one.
Well, why is it that the ownership thing specifically? I mean, aside from just like the fact that we culturally recoil at that, we're living in societies where we just abhor the idea of owning people. But do you think there's like a specific argument for why ownership should be like substantially worse than just putting people under compulsory labor conditions without owning them?
Yeah, I think the owning of a person as distinct from the owning of a person's labor feels very like bad to like my understanding of like human freedom. Like it's one thing to say like, oh, I own this thing that you made, but to say or when you are on these hours you work for me, but to own the person in their totality, that feels like the most antithetical you could be to like the spirit of like freedom or like bodily autonomy, which is like which is a very high good to me. In the same way that I care about human suffering, I just care about freedom in that sense.
And why would you say that you care about freedom?
I just do. Probably because if I don't have a logical justification, it's probably something to do with human psychology.
Okay, I mean, my guess would be that it's just it's a value that we're raised with that gets talked up a lot in our culture, and we've probably just internalized it to be a thing worth caring about. I think it's actually like hard to justify it without just appealing to one, the material conditions, and two, the fact that people just seem to hate being coerced. They just seem to hate the idea of it, regardless of what effect.
I mean, I don't think it's any hard to justify than like any other moral axiom of like human suffering. Like I don't think there's a good reason why like murder is inherently wrong. I just think we choose. God, I'm philosophically illiterate, but there's some really good terms to really. How so?
Well, because things like violence and suffering and murder get a similar response across all historical times and places, right? There's no society that I know of ever in history that has thought violence and suffering and murder were good, and this is sufficient to make me think that there's probably something like biologically or logistically intrinsic to human societies that it's just like inescapably like a human society just doesn't work if it fails to condemn things like violence and suffering and murder, right? But I'm not sure the same thing is true with freedom.
I think I would agree with your descriptive analysis, but I don't think that answers the prescriptive question. I think something that begs the question: well, why ought we value a society that can continue in the first place, that is effective? Why ought we form society in such a way that humans are able to work and live their lives?
Oh yeah. Well, I only meant to be answering the descriptive question, right? Because I mean, I don't literally.
Okay, no, okay, then I agree. I see what you mean.
Yeah,
sorry, I think I misunderstood what you originally said.
Yeah, I don't think there's like a literal objective way to say like universally people should value stability in society or that they should value freedom or anything like that. But I think there's a selection pressure for societies that have certain types of values, right? And if a society that just allows people to run around murdering each other just will not survive, right?
That makes sense to me.
I don't think it's the case that societies have to value freedom to survive.
Okay, interesting, huh? Yeah, okay, I think I agree.
Also enjoyed some legal protections. If they were badly beaten by their owners, they could flee to a temple, and their owner might be forced to sell them. Slaves were also allowed to participate in business.
Okay, I'm gonna need a really big, like, explanation of how often did this actually happen. Because if it is the case that this actually was a thing, and like the slaves were legitimately prevented from being physically abused excessively, I mean, excessively, so it's still pretty horrific. That would still be a significant improvement. But that I would really like to see a citation for the idea that was actually like put into practice, not that it existed on some piece of paper somewhere.
I would have guessed that this is probably just a much more violent society on average than ours is today, right?
Yeah,
So
that as well. Yeah,
they probably just you would have had to have a really high threshold for bad treatment or cruelty, like much higher than we would have liked. That would be my guess.
Yeah.
I mean, I know most of human history, like, men were just beating their wives and children, and nobody, and like, I was about to say nobody really minded. That's not quite true, but people would kind of look at it like if you were especially cruel and violent with your family, they might look down on you for it. I would guess that much the same thing would apply to slaves. That there's just some amount of cruelty that people would just shrug it off.
Mm-hmm.
Provided they gave their owners a share of the earnings. And better off slaves reportedly dressed...
That was a huge caveat. So even after you're freed, you still have to give some of the earnings back? Jesus Christ. Okay.
Similarly to free Athenians. The Athenian government also employed a number of slaves. Many of them were given an allowance and were allowed to live where they pleased. Considering the standards of the time, Athenians were known for being mild to their slaves, and it was even common judgment that it was better to be a slave in Athens than a poor free man in an oligarchic state. But I doubt that was of much consolation to the slaves working in the silver mines. It's a bit more controversial how Athenian men regarded Athenian women. Thucydides infamously reported Pericles to have said, at the end of his funeral oration, that female excellence meant to be least talked about among the men, whether for good or for bad. In keeping with that, average female citizens were rarely talked about in Athenian literature. Aristotle opened his Politics, claiming that, while on one hand, men and women need each other for reproduction, on the other hand, some are naturally rulers, and others are naturally ruled. Rulers, he says, use their minds, and the ruled use their bodies, which seems to be implying that men are naturally a ruling class over women. Since women weren't invited into politics, that seems at least fairly representative of Athenian public opinion. So this was a deeply patriarchal society. The woman's place was understood to be not in politics, but in the home, out of sight. As probably the strongest piece of evidence for that, we don't even know the name of Pericles' wife. That being said, not all male citizens were always allowed into their democracy. Under Cleisthenes, a procedure was introduced that allowed the Athenian public to banish someone from their society. The procedure was called an ostracism. If 6,000 people in the assembly voted in an ostracism, then the person with the most names would be forced to leave Athens for 10 years. So that's something that happened to high-profile people, typically disgraced politicians, and presumably during tense times, considering how many votes needed to be cast. So ostracisms probably worked to relieve domestic pressures. If someone was causing a lot of trouble in Athens, and the Athenian public wanted them gone, they had the means to do it. I think it's worth...
Yeah, that's also, that's an incredible way of making sure that, like, significant reform probably never happens if all you need to do is scrape together 6,000 people. Admittedly, it's still a smaller city. I think it was, what, they said, like, they had 30,000 slaves, were made up about a third of Athens' population, so about 6% of the population, but still, I mean, just thinking about our politics, man, if it only took 6% of the country to get you banished from politics, oh my lord. Oh, that would be a very different political landscape.
Yeah, although I think wasn't it the case that, like, the 6,000 people who got together, it's not like a self-selected group though, right? It's like a just a assembly of not quite random citizens, but like only certain people are allowed to participate, right? So it didn't...
Hold on, let me just back up, double check.
Okay.
Voted in an ostracism were always allowed into their democracy. Under Cleisthenes, a procedure was introduced that allowed the Athenian public to banish someone from their society. The procedure was called an ostracism. If 6,000 people in the assembly voted in an ostracism, then the person with the most names would be forced to leave Athens for 10 years. So that's something that
I
happens
still
to
think
high-profile
the
people.
take that you gave is basically right though, where like if somebody just
Yeah,
ruffles,
it'll be to a much lesser degree though.
yeah, it's gonna be like a conservative cultural force that because if anybody ruffles enough feathers, they'll just get kicked out.
Typically disgraced politicians, and presumably during tense times, considering how many votes needed to be cast. So ostracisms probably worked to relieve domestic pressures. If someone was causing a lot of trouble in Athens, and the Athenian public wanted them gone, they had the means to do it. I think it's worth reflecting on that process, and what it seems to say about Athenian society. When the Athenians wanted someone gone, they didn't kill them, and they didn't throw them in jail, never to be seen again. Instead, they just forced them to leave for 10 years.
Sometimes they
and after
did
that
kill
10
or
years,
jail people also.
Yeah, I would be really surprised if they never killed people.
they'd be allowed to come back. So it was a fundamentally peaceful process, and I think it's
No, it is not.
Yeah, it's
How do you
not.
think they were being kicked out? Like they just asked, and if they said no, they'd be like, "Well, darn it. Well, I guess if you want to stay, there's nothing we can do." No, it would have been like, "Leave. Oh, you're gonna stay. We're gonna kill you, or we're gonna threaten to kill you, and then you're gonna have to leave, bro."
No, we're just gonna keep voting to make like
Yeah,
no. This time
this
you
is-
really have to leave.
Yeah. Just wait until the next assembly comes around, guys. I think the next assembly is gonna like me way more. All right, I promise. Yeah, man, this is why everyone needs to have gone through a libertarian arc. Because, like, on some level, the state is inherently coercive. Like, come on, even if we think that's okay, you know, I'd rather live in a slightly coercive society with a state than the level of coercion of anarchy, which is probably gonna be way, way higher. Yeah, that's a really foolish thing to say.
Mm-hmm.
civil one. That being said, there is some evidence of fraud during those ostracisms, so the process might have sometimes been manipulated. Illiterate
Oops.
voters, for example,
Stop
might have been
steal.
used for political purposes.
Illiterate voter. All right, everyone, write down the name of. All right, we're kicking out Jeff. We're kicking out Bob. Oh, I hate Jeff. How do I spell that? B-O-B. All right, let me write that down. Oh my God, man. Sometimes ancient society. Man, I don't want to do. Okay, I'm just gonna do it. I feel like ancient societies were just really dumb. Like these people, like, I don't know, the way people are described. It's like, have you ever seen one of those memes where it'll be like a picture of Sun Tzu, and it'll be like there'll be text above Sun Tzu, and it'll be like, make sure to try to deceive your enemy, and then it'll be like a soy jack, like, wow, that's such a good idea. I never thought of that. Like when they instituted this system, did no one stop and be like, guys, people can't read and we're using paper ballots. We should do something about that. Like, that just seems such a basic thing to catch.
I think they
would do a better job, man.
They didn't. I don't think it's that the people back then were dumber on average or anything like that. I think it's that they didn't have the same body of like literature and history to draw on.
Probably.
I'm sure there were probably like random ass smart people in Athens who could have foreseen that this kind of thing might happen, but in order for anybody to do anything about it, you have to get enough traction, and people have to believe in the concept, which means it has to be like culturally embedded on some level. And back then there just wasn't precedent in order enough to get it embedded.
Yeah, I think that is basically correct. It's still just sometimes when you read these things, it's like, really, no one thought this was going to be a problem.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah.
So, what happened to this system? What happened to Athenian democracy? Why do we talk about it in the past tense? Well, democracy in Athens became expensive. The assembly voted to institute
Late stage
for more and more
capitalism.
public positions, namely in the military and the jury. Money for those positions had to come from somewhere, and Athens found the answer in empire. So democracy in Athens came to depend on empire. They increasingly stretched
Oh my God, just like how
over the rest of
capitalism relies on
Greece.
exploitation.
They also sent ambitious campaigns abroad to Egypt and Sicily. Things reached a breaking point. Sentiment in Greece turned against the Athenians. Resistance to Athenian policy came from nearly every state in Greece. The viability of democracy was also an open question in Athenian time. It was notably rejected by aristocrats and the upper class.
Oh, you
that
don't
led
say.
to divisions at home and a lack of intellectual support from many of the brightest minds at the time, like Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle. By Aristotle's time, the most extreme oligarchs were reported to have sworn the following oath: I will be evil-minded to the demos, and will plot whatever evil I can against them. Athens would go on.
Okay, I'm sure it's just like, oh, back in those days, evil didn't, mean, universally bad.
It probably meant
That's just
hostile.
yeah, it's so funny. All right, what's our pledge gonna be? I'm gonna be a bad person.
Yeah, but it's not that hard for me to imagine somebody in a society
Yeah,
having to take an oath that's like, I swear to go out and vanquish our enemies, or something like that, right? I think that's probably closer to what they meant, is like, I swear to oppose the dangerous force that this represents.
Yeah. I don't know if you've ever seen a great show. I don't know if you've ever seen the Battlestar Galactica show.
No.
The modern. Wow, it's a great show. But like in that, there is a scene where like there is like a person who's having to do some really bad things in service of a fundamentally good cause, and they say some line where it's like, I'm doing a horrible thing for a good reason. And there are people like that in real life. Like I'm sure there have been, you can find plenty of people who are like, oh well, I've got to do the bad thing to save everyone, then so be it, I'll do it. So it's not hard for me to even imagine a world in which they meant they did know evil meant evil, but still said this. So that's just so funny though.
It's like, it sounds cartoonish, right? It sounds like it would be the oath of like a Sith Lord or something.
Yeah, what is it? Oh god, I used to know this. The Force will set me free. I know that's the last one.
To suffer a string of defeats that would lead to its fall. The end of the line for the old-style Athenian democracy came in 321, when Athens, subordinated under Macedon, added a wealth criterion for citizenship.
Womp womp.
Democracy disappeared in Athens and wouldn't reappear for thousands of years, this time in a modern form, influenced by the United States. We're about to turn our attention there, but I'd like to close this section out by reading a speech that Pericles was reported to give to the citizens of Athens. It was a dark time in the city. Plague had struck, and the tide of the war against Sparta seemed to be turning against Athens. I think it gives a sense of both the intelligence and the grandeur of the time. It reads, "Even if we should ever be forced to yield, for everything that grows great also decays, the memory of our greatness will be bequeathed to posterity forever, that all the Greeks ruled over more Greeks than anyone, that in the greatest wars we held out against enemies in alliance and individually, and that we lived in a city that was the most ingenious and the greatest."
I've kind of got some problems with his claim that democracy just disappeared for a couple thousand years, because I think there's some ambiguity to that, because in the times in between, there were republics, there were parliaments, there were voting systems. I mean, the College of Cardinals votes on the Pope, right? This is like, in some sense, that's a democracy, right? And then in other parts of the world, there were people voting on things. It's just.
Yeah, it feels like what he wants to say. It's like maybe explicitly. It wouldn't surprise me if like the actual term democracy, but like, yeah, it just doesn't. I really doubt that there's any like that's actually accurate. That there was none, not a single one anywhere that was like, yeah, guys, I think more people should have a say.
Yeah, I mean, there were a whole bunch of merchant republics in the Middle Ages. And so obviously those aren't going to be the kind of thing where everybody in the society has a say, but neither was Athens, right? It was like a subset of their society voting.
Yeah,
so.
I don't know how you could define it in such a way that Athens counts, but nothing else before America does, or in between America and Athens. That seems like a pretty impossible task.
Yeah. Maybe they had like a larger percentage of people in the participating in politics or something like that.
We see the wisdom of Solon's remark that no more good must be attempted than the nation can bear. Thomas Jefferson, corresponding with Walter Jones, 1801. If you think about it, democracy in Athens, as told by its literature, manifested itself as a class struggle, a struggle between the many and the few. Democracy was implemented when the many won that struggle and took control of politics. But the few always resented the many. Democracy in Athens ended with the few reclaiming power and the many losing it. Democracy in America, by contrast, manifested itself as less of a class struggle and more of a moderate compromise, probably most powerfully embodied in the philosophy of James Madison, the principal framer of the Constitution. For that to make sense, we need some context. I think the best place to start is to look at the state of democracy before the founding of the United States. In the mid-1700s, ancient Greece was thousands of years in the rearview mirror of history. Available literature at the time was limited, so people's understandings of ancient Greece at the time were also accordingly limited. So that meant that even though they created what's considered the first modern democratic nation, only a few of the US founders were at all familiar with ancient Greek history or political thought. What little they knew mostly came from only two sources, Thucydides and the biographer Plutarch, with Plutarch being probably by far the bigger source. That translated into the founders not showing much interest in ancient Athens. They mentioned it sparingly, and typically in a passing fashion. But there was an ancient society that they were more interested in. Intellectuals at the time, in both America and Europe, showed far more interest in classical Rome and the concept of republicanism that's associated with its society before Caesar. That meant that leading up to the revolution, there were two main political philosophies on the table, republicanism and monarchism. So it was republicanism that ended up replacing monarchism. There's a few things to say about that. For one, the concept of republicanism wasn't precisely understood at the time. For example, Alexander Hamilton said that it was used in a variety of senses. And John Adams said, even after the founding, that he never understood what it was and thought that no man ever did or will.
Wait, that's hilarious. Hold on, I wanna back up. See, let's see here. So confused and blended did monarchy and republicanism become in the 18th century that people, especially in the English-speaking world, had trouble precisely defining them. Republicanism, in particular, assumed a wide range of meanings, and as Alexander Hamilton said, was, quote, used in various senses, end quote. By the early 19th century, John Adams professed to believe that he had, quote, never understood, end quote, what republicanism was, and thought that, quote, no other man ever did or ever will, end quote. He concluded in frustration that republicanism, quote, may signify anything, everything, and nothing, end quote. And it did, becoming at times, that's the end of that.
That he never understood what it was.
I think it's legitimately a little bit hard to say exactly what a republic is, though, right? I mean, it's some form of bureaucratic state where
it's like trying to define a chair.
Right. But you know, it's well, I mean, it's like, can you have a state that is both a republic and a monarchy at the same time, right? I mean, maybe that is what we have in America, right?
No.
Thought that no man ever did or will. To further confuse things, the words republic and democracy were so closely associated in the minds of the colonists that they are often used synonymously. We have an understanding now that the word republic is different because it refers to a representative government, but that distinction had only barely begun to exist at the time. It was apparently invented in 1787 for polemical purposes by James Madison, who argued that pure democracies have a small number of citizens who assemble and administer the government in person, while republics have a scheme of representation. But that was a distinction with no basis in prior history.
Yeah, it's also like that's not at all what people mean these days when they use those terms. Like no one's saying, democracy, where only a small group of people who are in Washington D.C. are going to be able to affect any change.
I'm not even sure that this is a distinction, right? Because if you get a small number of citizens who assemble and administer the government, aren't they representing the people when they do that? Isn't that a scheme of representation?
Well, the question, I think, would be, what do you mean by representing? Like, in a sense, but that's different from people choosing specific representatives to represent them, as opposed to just taking a random selection and hoping that that is representative.
Sure. So like the ancient Roman Republic did not have democratically elected representatives, though, right? So are we going to say that that's not a republic? Like the senators weren't voted on.
Sorry, can you repeat that question again?
Like the ancient Roman Republic and a bunch of the medieval republics had representative forms of government where the representatives were not democratically elected by the peasants or whatever.
Yes. I think that in a way that would be sort of a sort of republic. Yes, or at the very least, that specific aspect would be Republican.
Sure. So, like a Roman senator, would you say that person is a representative?
Potentially, actually, yes.
Oh, okay, so then if that's true, then I just don't see any distinction between these things at all, right? Because we could look at the Roman Senate and we could say that that's a small number of citizens assembling and administering the government in person. It's also a scheme of representation, right?
Yeah, I think the key is just I think what it comes down to is the intent by which it is contrived. If you're choosing someone to be an actor in the hope that they will be representative, versus if the people that are being represented have some say in choosing who is their representative, that even though those people are both trying to act as representatives, there's like a big difference there.
Sure. I mean, is that difference relevant to whether it's a republic or not?
I don't know. I feel like in the way that we use I feel like colloquially, yes, but technically, I'm not sure.
Yeah, because like before, because most historical republics that happened, but before the United States, did have some kind of like assembly or council or parliamentary body that was gathering together, making decisions. Those people were generally not elected by the peasantry of that country, they were there to represent the country, right?
Yeah, I think the key would be we can imagine a scenario where those people would not be representing the people, feel no obligation, or there was no intent in their selection to represent the people. Like like the czars of Russia, in a way represented the country of Russia diplomatically, but they were ostensibly just acting their own personal interests. Whereas if there's like a genuine attempt to actually be truly representative, then that feels more getting into like the intent of representation in the first place.
Okay, so what
Perhaps,
would you?
perhaps I think it's like a question of like a false representative. Like you're ostensibly you are supposing to represent this thing, but really you're actually not.
How about like the British House of Lords? Are those representatives?
Um, at this stage of history, I'm inclined to say no, because it feels like that is in opposition to the status quo of like the House of Commons. But back in the day, I could potentially see some of those lords being representatives. Yes, if there was a lord who genuinely went to his people, or not even necessarily went to his people, but if there's a lord who genuinely in his mind attempted to and was to a varying degree successful at representing the genuine interests of the area that he was from, then I think that would theoretically would be representative. I just think the trick is that typically doesn't happen, so we wouldn't consider that we wouldn't consider that to be very representative. We would say they're doing a poor job of representation. But if all the alternatives are even worse, then I guess in a sense it could be Republican.
Okay, so the distinction just exists in the mind of the representative then?
I think the distinction exists in how effective it is, which is highly dependent upon the mind of the representative. If there's no accountability, if the only way to ensure that the representative is doing, if or not the representative, if the only way to ensure that the person who goes to the institution of government and acts, if the only check to make sure that they are actually representing the people, or rather, if there is no check, then that system is the vast majority of the time not actually going to be representative. So in a way, it's like, is a broken car fast? Well, no, typically we don't think of broken cars as fast, but theoretically, if you had a broken car and for some reason it was going fast, then it literally would be. But we're using that word as an approximation of the process as it plays out in the averages. So a dictator could be a great representative, but the vast majority of dictators aren't. So we generally don't consider dictators to be representatives.
Yeah, although I think almost every dictator claims to be a representative. Right?
Yeah, they might claim to be. Yeah, that's of an important distinction as well.
Okay, so then it seems like you're thinking of this not in terms of whether the person's job is to represent their constituents, but rather in terms of whether their decisions effectively do represent their constituents.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, because the question would be, what if, like, if it was your job not to be a representative, I would expect those people generally to not be representatives. But it could be theoretically possible. I mean, if we took someone who is if we took a hypothetical person who absolutely is a representative, and then we said, okay, we're going to change your job, so the intent of your job isn't to do that, and they still did those original things, I don't think we can say, well, then now they're not a representative because we changed the name. I think it has to be. I think the definition has to refer to like the actual function.
To the actual function in terms of like how good of a job they do.
In terms of what is actually taking place. Like if a person, if we took Thomas Jefferson, and he from being representative of the people, and we said, no, you're not President Thomas Jefferson anymore, you're a dictator for life who doesn't represent the people, Thomas Jefferson, and he didn't change anything, I feel like that he would still be a representative, even if because like the thing that I care about is the actions, not the literal wording. It's just that if there was a position like dictator that wasn't intended to be a representative, none of the like institutions were grafted in such a way to be cohesive representation, I wouldn't expect most of those people to actually be representatives. But it's possible. Okay,
so then in order to be a representative, does that mean they have to govern according to popular opinion?
I think it means there needs to be. I think it means. It has to come down to a holistic evaluation of how comparatively better are they doing at representing than the alternative.
And representing is measured in terms of popular opinion, or no?
I think that's a really difficult thing to do. I think popular opinion plays a part, but there also has to be some decision making on the behalf of that representative. Like a great question is like in America, our primary processes are open. So if you want to say, hey, I want the representative of the Democratic Party to be Joe Biden, you can do that. Depending on the state, you might have to make sure you're registered in advance, but ostensibly anyone can, as long as they have the ability to vote. That's not the case in other countries. In Canada, you have to be a dues-paying member of the Liberal Party to say, I want our representative to be Justin Trudeau. Now, you can still vote however you want, but that's an interesting question. Which better represents the will of the people? It used to be in America that, the party just chose. They might make compromises on what the people want in the context of just choosing for the Democratic Party to better choose for what people want in the context of a general election. I really don't know how to make evaluations between those as to what is more truly representative. That feels like a thing that's really difficult. I would give that caveat, but I would say generally yes. Like, it's difficult to say what's better, an open primary or closed primary, a jungle primary. What is truly the best way of representing the people? But all of those are better than like no one gets to vote.
I wonder if another way to like describe what a republic is could be in terms of like delegating other people to vote for you, right?
Yeah, because in that sense, fundamentally, that means that you are the holder of the power and that they're accountable to you. And I think structurally that is what we would describe as like republicanism or a republic. But I think the essence of that is getting at, the thing that makes that good isn't that specific process, but that process encourages the principle of those people being represented.
Do you think the rule of law concept has anything to do with whether it's a republic or not?
I feel like it has to, because like you could imagine you could imagine a republic that doesn't have perfect rule of law, but you really can't imagine a republic that has literally zero rule of law. There is like the lowest possible rule of law. Like almost any like evolved society with complex systems and rules can't operate in that environment. So I feel like it has to on some level.
Yeah, so maybe it's like necessary but not sufficient or something.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it.
Pretty much all of the earlier republics, including Rome, fit into Madison's definition of a democracy. So throughout history, and throughout 18th century America, the words democracy and republic were used interchangeably. They didn't refer to different types of popular government, and instead reflected differences in language. Democracy came from Greek, the rule of the people, and republic came from Latin. Res publicas meant thing of the people. So that was a lot of mental work to basically bring us back to square one. The American founders were setting out to transform America from a monarchy into a republic, but the words republic and democracy were interchangeable at the time. So they were setting out to do something that was closer to the spirit of classical Athens than you might think. Even though understandings of republicanism were messy at the time, there was still a clear enough idea of what it was. As a historian at the time put it, you can think of it as the difference between subjects and citizens. Citizens lived in republics, while subjects lived in monarchies. To be a subject is to be under the rule of another, while to be a citizen means to be a unit in a mass of free people who collectively possess sovereignty. I'm basically describing democratic Athens here, but as you're probably aware, American democracy only partially resembles Athenian democracy, so there's more to the picture here than the American people simply collectively owning sovereignty. I think the best way to explain the particular character of American democracy is to break the story of the creation of American democracy down into two storylines. The first storyline is similar enough to the Athenian one. That's the story of rejecting authoritarian power and spreading the ideas of freedom and equality under the law. Basically the spreading of isonomia in America. Even before the revolution, Americans didn't feel close to the English monarchy. It felt to them like an extraneous overlaid power, too far across the ocean for its majesty to be felt. They also felt tired of the system it was based in, which was a system of patronage, which is a system where your connection and loyalty to others determines your prospects in life, including your prospects in politics. Americans over time came to see patronage in starkly negative terms. They came to see it as a form of dependency on the authorities above you, and it became patriotic to free yourself from these dependent connections and influences. There was also, importantly, a sort of proto-industrialization happening at the time, as huge numbers of farmers and artisans started to take up manufacturing and trading. Average Americans were becoming noticeably wealthier, and were even starting to engage in luxury.
Hamiltonians rise up.
This was a new concept, the idea that anyone could work and become wealthy. Work before then had been thought of as something that you necessarily had to do for bare survival. Basically, the poor worked and stayed poor. So the colonists were enthusiastic about what was happening to them, and were simultaneously worried about the possibility of losing their newfound wealth. They saw themselves as being especially vulnerable to the English monarchy. So that led to the development of a new Republican philosophy of property. Americans came to see property as something that makes people equally free and independent. Property became people's source of personal authority. They thought that anyone could work to own property, and owning it could protect you from the outside world. So as these ideas came together, Americans came to reject monarchism and the old set of values that were associated with it, like loyalty, order, stability, and hierarchies. And they came to support republicanism and the new set of values associated with that: liberty, equality, and independence. A veneration of property came along with it, since property was thought to make independence possible. Equality, in particular, became a rallying call for those seeking to challenge authority and superiority. By equality, they mostly meant equality of opportunity. They were rejecting patronage and trying to dream up a new world based in merit, a world where all offices lie open to men of merit, of whatever rank or condition. But equality also came to mean something new, something like equality of spirit, the idea that all people are inherently equal inside, best captured in Thomas Jefferson's statement in the Declaration of Independence: all men are created equal. That was the radical opposite of monarchy. From here, the storyline's familiar. The Americans declared independence, fought a war with England, and won it. They then had an opportunity to form a new government based on principles of their choosing, and the principles on their minds were liberty, equality, and independence. We can call that the end of storyline 1. You can associate it with thinkers like Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson. But we still have storyline 2. You can associate this one with John Adams, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton. This storyline is a storyline about skepticism towards republicanism and democracy. Part of that skepticism began pretty much right away. The Declaration had barely been signed when some of the revolutionary leaders began expressing doubts about the republican virtue of the American people. There were new popular leaders emerging who were far less educated and far less broad-minded than many of the revolutionary leaders had expected. These new leaders promoted their own local selfish interests at the expense of what the founders saw as the public good. Shays' Rebellion in 1786 likely made things worse, when thousands put up armed resistance to paying debt and taxes, which ended in an attempt to overthrow the standing government. Something that added to their skepticism of democracy was their philosophy of the nature of power. They believed that concentrations of power were dangerous, and that it had the tendency to grow out of control if unchecked. For example, George Mason said, "From the nature of man, we may be sure that those who have power in their hands will always, when they can, increase it." That extended towards the public. They believed if a majority of Americans gained a certain amount of power, they'd use that power to further increase it and oppress everyone else. Here's Hamilton saying it. "Give all power to the many."
And the founders just ripped off our whole stream here. We're talking about like the structure of the thing being conducive to the essence as a means of defining it. Like, what the hell, man? Where's our royalties?
Yeah, for real.
Will oppress the few. Although, for what it's worth, it worked in reverse. Give all power to the few, they will oppress the many. The reading materials available to the founders at the time also turned their opinions against democracy. Reading Plutarch, Thucydides, Xenophon, Plato, and Aristotle all made the founders believe that pure forms of democracy, where the people directly control politics, were dangerous. The founders believed, rightly or wrongly, that pure democracies drove themselves into self-destruction over time with their policies. And yes, their language was that dramatic. Here's Madison. "Democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, have ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property, and have, in general, been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths. The state that was most held to that charge was the purest democracy of all, Athens." So they believed that pure democracies, like Athens, needed to be saved from themselves with institutional safeguards, and the lack of those safeguards is what drove those societies into ruin. So you have these two conflicting storylines, and they don't easily reconcile with one another. How do you make the public sovereign if you don't trust them? But time was ticking. The provisional government was running out of money, and new government had to be made. But what would that government look like? The prospect was overwhelming. No one had ever successfully made a popular government at anything close to the scale of the United States. John Adams, in his frustration, said, "The lawgivers of antiquity legislated for single cities. Who can legislate for 20 or 30 states, each of which is greater than Greece or Rome?" The answer came, more than anyone, from James Madison. He said that politics consist of conflicting interests. Any one group that stands behind a particular interest is a faction. He then says we should expect factions to look out for their own interests, which might be against other people's interests and might be against the community's interests. So in this scheme, there's not a limit on the amount of factions there can be, and factions can be majorities or minorities. He then says we should design a government where it's difficult for any one faction to gain control over the whole thing. In practice, that meant making 3 branches of government, each with limited power, and each with the ability to check the power of the others. The legislative branch was further broken into 2 chambers, one intended to represent the many, and the other intended to represent the few. Only after both chambers approve legislation can it be sent to the president to sign into law. So the complexity of the system makes it difficult for any one faction to grab the reins of government for itself. It'd be much more difficult than, say, persuading a single assembly. A network of further checks was laid in place either at the time or shortly after, guaranteeing individual rights by law, like property rights or free speech, limits the government's power against citizens, but also limits the majority's ability to use the government against other citizens. An independent judiciary places the highest legal decisions outside of public control. Limiting national power against state power is another one, protecting minority populations in states against national majority populations. It was also decided to make America a representative democracy, and they had a few reasons for that. For one, it made practical sense. In a country the size of the United States, it didn't make sense to expect average citizens to commute to wherever decisions were made, or to keep up with the intricacies of politics. The larger a country is, and the more connected it is to other countries, the more complicated its politics become. It seemed to make more sense to hire representatives who could travel and spend their time keeping up with the complexity of politics. Representatives were also thought to be a check on what they saw as the emotional excesses of popular crowds. Madison argued that passing the public's views through representatives allowed the cooler wisdom of an elite few to best discern the interests of the country.
Pause for a second.
You can take it or leave it, but that was his logic.
Yeah, that seems like a very counterintuitive argument that he's making here. That when you put power, instead of taking the large group of people and like relying on the emotional excesses of a crowd, you would instead rather rely on the emotional excesses of a single person. It just seems like the more you distribute that out to a bigger crowd, it's going to average out more, and I think it's actually harder to emotionally move a crowd than it is a single person.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think I think it's more a question of having both present in the system, as opposed to just one or the other. It's about having it so there are areas where one person does make the call. Like it's probably a good thing that the chair of the Fed isn't popularly elected. That's probably a good thing. But it's also a good thing that we have a popular election for. Well, we have a popular election in certain things, and in other areas it's not quite a popular election. It uses electoral delegates, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it's about having a balance within the system.
Yeah, and I mean, I get their point about trying to make the system bureaucratically complex, so that it's more difficult for any one part of it to prevail over the others. I mean, that makes sense, but yeah, I don't know.
Logic. He was trying to prevent, for example, the public from voting for short-term policies that would doom the country in the long run. Most of what makes this system democratic is that these representatives are chosen by the citizens, so the representatives have to compete against each other in an election. They have to run for office and convince the public that they're the right person for the job. That also makes this government somewhat accountable to the people, in that these representatives probably want to please the public in order to attain and secure their jobs. So going up to the very highest offices, the citizens choose who they want to represent them, and if they don't like their performance, in the next election cycle, they can peacefully rotate them out of a job. So what they ended up with was a government where the people had control over the very highest officials in charge, like the president and members of Congress.
Okay, so I thought there's an interesting comparison there between when he said peacefully rotate them out of a job versus when we were early talking about people being peacefully exiled from Athens, right? Do you get where I'm going with that?
Yeah.
Because if you try to peacefully exile somebody from the city, well, it's peaceful if they agree to make it peaceful, right? And if they say no, they may have to be removed by force, right? And and in the United States, we have a norm of peaceful transitions of power, but that's not inherently peaceful. It's just peaceful because people go along with the norm. It's backed up by a threat of coercive force. And I think that that's actually just pretty much exactly the same thing that's probably going on with some ancient exile. With the one thing that might be different about it is that a person who gets exiled might be an unusually disagreeable person who's likely to stir up trouble more so than a president getting voted out of office.
Yeah,
whose name is not Donald Trump.
Yeah, I think the key is not just is it coercive, but is it unjustly coercive? Right, it is coercive to shoot someone who's attacking you, to be like, don't attack me or I'm going to shoot you. But that's probably pretty justified. So the question is, should you be entitled to not be kicked out of your country, seemingly for any reason, just as long as enough people support you, versus should you be entitled to remain in the office of the president? I think that's the key question when it comes to these are both coercive, but might we draw a distinction as to which is more justified?
Yeah, the thing is, I actually think a person losing the presidency is probably a bigger downgrade than a person getting kicked out of Athens, right?
Yeah, that's the interesting thing.
So in a way, they have more reason to resist it, possibly. I guess I don't know how dangerous it might be to get kicked out of Athens, but I wouldn't think it would be that bad to just go live in a different Greek city.
Yeah, I think that's going to come down to a bunch of questions of that we aren't going to have the answers for. Was it safe to travel and stuff like this, and could you actually I'm not too sure about that. I think the interesting thing is, in a way, you have more to lose, but that which you're in the example of being the president. But it's almost like, man, you kind of deserve to lose that. So that stuff deserves to be potentially more up on the table for whether or not you get to have it, as opposed to just having like having your place of residence in your home.
Yeah, just getting banished because you're an unpopular person who might not even be powerful or something, right? But do you buy into what he's saying about like peaceful transitions of power? Does that make sense? Like,
Yeah. I mean, I think fundamentally it's peaceful because there isn't resistance, but there is still coercion. I just think, when we say coercion, typically we always mean unjust coercion. I think this might be an instance of justified coercion.
okay, so then like I just find it a little bit hard to reconcile that with what we were saying earlier about the peaceful exile of people from Athens.
Yeah, well, I think like it's fundamentally different depending upon like the thing that is being taken away, right? Is if I'm kicking you out of your home versus I'm kicking you out of my home. In both cases, it could be peaceful, but the understanding is if you don't, it's going to get violent. But one is, I think, very clearly more coercive by the nature of whether or not you should be allowed to have authority over the thing or not. Like, it shouldn't be up to me whether or not I kick you out of your home. It probably should be up to me whether or not I kick you out of my home.
I mean, I think peace peace only happens when both sides of a conflict agree to peace, right? If either side decides it's not going to be peaceful, then it's not, right? So I don't think we can necessarily look at like, here's what the law commands you to do and say like necessarily it will be peaceful, because we don't know how people will respond to that. Like, it'll be peaceful if people cooperate with the law and do as they're told, and it will not be peaceful if they don't.
Yeah, but I think when people are saying that, they're not referring to just whether or not it strictly will or won't, but what it's likely to do, right? Like, it's probably like the American the peaceful transfer of power is peaceful because it's peaceful, but it seems like it's a lot more likely to be peaceful than like the revolution.
Yeah. Do you think it's more likely to be peaceful than a person getting exiled from Athens, though?
In America, yes. In other contexts, I'm not sure. I think that mostly just has to do with the fact that I'm not sure how peaceful it really was in Athens, but I think generally yes.
Yeah, so I think we could look at historical precedent for America and say like lots of people have been peacefully removed from office, and that's the reason that we consider it peaceful. It's not so much that the structure of the system is intrinsically peaceful. It's more just that like this is the historical norm, and we don't know whether that's true for Athenian exiles or not.
Yeah.
We don't have.
Well,
this...
yeah. Well, but I do think the reason I do think you can make some level of claim about the structure based on the fact that it is going well. Like we can't say we don't. Clearly something is going right here, such that we might say it seems like perhaps having a high level of development. If your country's very rich, it seems like people are probably less willing to put down their iPhones and pick up AR-15s, or maybe it's because it's a democracy. But I do think we have some indication that there's something good about the process.
Well, I mean, the process of removing people from office only can work in a society that's relatively peaceful and in which people accept the process. So just the existence of that norm is evidence of a peaceful society. But yeah.
Yeah, no, yes, but the continued existence but the continued existence over time does suggest that the fact that it was maintained and not overthrown by something else, I think, is suggestive of something else. Because it's not the case that every place that has peaceful transfer of power remains that way forever. So there must be something else going on underlying that.
Yeah, well, I mean, every society that has peaceful transfer of power, it exists for only like a limited amount of time, right? And so we just haven't come to the end of ours yet. I don't know that means that we're exceptional in any other way other than the fact that we're in a society that is presently ongoing and hasn't yet been replaced by something else, whereas we're looking back in history at these other societies that we can already see, we have hindsight on how they ended and not on how ours will end.
Yes, but I do think at the very least you could make some claim about societies that were in similar periods of time or similar sets of conditions that didn't last as long as us, right? So, like, if a certain kind of society doesn't manage to last 200 years in a situation like America does, and America does, and you're able to demonstrate that repeatedly, then it seems like you could probably make some sort of conclusion that, well, it seems like there's something going on here beyond just like randomness.
I guess. I actually think it's really hard to find historical comparisons for a society that's
true,
similarly
yeah.
situated for stability. I mean, we've had societies that were like relatively isolated and lasted a long time, right? Like Japan's been sitting there for 2,000 years, but but obviously, they're not a democracy, and they weren't always peaceful, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know what to make of that.
And that the people get to pick who they are and get rid of them if they don't like them. But they also create a government that's difficult and even near impossible to control in its entirety. In short, the American people can only hope for, at best, partial and somewhat indirect control over their government. Exclusions at the time made the initial system even more undemocratic. American politics have in some ways become more democratic over time, and in other ways, less democratic. For the sake of not repeating myself, I think the best place to cover that will be in the conclusion. So, let's get to that. I started this video out saying I would end it by squaring the concept of democracy against both societies. So, it's time to do that. Let's start with a definition. I'd say democracy is a form of political organization where the people living under political institutions simultaneously exercise control over them. To be transparent, I got that wording by reformulating a statement that Sean Wilentz made in The Rise of American Democracy, when he said, "Democracy appears when some large number of previously excluded ordinary persons, what the 18th century called the many, secure the power not simply to select their governors, but to oversee the institutions of government." Virtually all the definitions I've seen center around the same idea. The idea that democracy is government by the people, with the people being understood as broadly as possible. But I prefer definitions that are less abstract and more precise. Another way to say it is that you have democracy when the people living under a government control it. If we can accept that, then the task of figuring out whether society is democratic or not becomes relatively simple. We have two main factors here: the people and their control. To figure out then how democratic a society is, you have to answer, how broadly realized is this concept of the people? When we're talking about democracy, we're talking about realizing the people in terms of political equality. Are there exclusions? Is there one type of person being privileged over another? That reduces democracy. It makes that society less democratic. The second factor is control. How thorough is the people's control over their institutions? For our purposes today, we're only going to square this against Athens and America, and we're going to start by looking at Athens. The control that Athenian citizens had over their government was incredibly thorough. The citizens directly controlled the three most powerful organs of government: the assembly.
Big caveat with the fact that we're talking about citizens, which
Right.
it's not like he's trying to necessarily avoid that. He has talked about it, but I think that it sort of underscores the point is like, even when you're saying, oh, we're so democratic, there's sort of some underlying questions of like, well, what does that actually mean?
Yeah, Greek male Athenian citizens who were not slaves or whatever, right? Do you buy into the thing he was saying earlier about like he was saying something like if a society is less equal, then it's less democratic? How much do you think that makes sense?
I think being less democratic is something that's really difficult to detect in the margins. I'm only comfortable sort of making those proclamations when when it's very dramatic. So like, we're much more democratic now than we were in 1850. We don't have slavery, women can vote, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In fact, actually, I just chose 1850 randomly. I wonder where we would be at with landowners voting. Andrew Jackson, I don't know when. There's no Andrew Jackson was 1850. That's way too late.
I want to say he was like 1820 or 1830-ish.
Yeah, somewhere in there. Anyways, but the point is, in that sense, I think we are much more democratic. But are we more democratic now, for example, or specifically, was the changes made in the aftermath of the 1964 DNC riots, did those make us more democratic? Where now we get to choose we get much more public involvement in our primaries. I don't know. It's very difficult when you're talking about a process that is grounded in the real world, where you can't just read minds and be like, oh, that's what everyone thinks. There we go. That is, I think, a lot more difficult to make any proclamations on. In that instance, I'd be a lot more just results oriented. I don't know if it's more democratic for us to be able to all vote in the party primaries, but it seems to have much better results.
I wonder if it's worth distinguishing between a couple different kinds of equality here, right? Because you could have like a society with equality with respect to like how much political participation and control people have over the government, like that could be like broadly equal, but then you don't necessarily have equal treatment under the law, or vice versa, right? Like you could have one without the other. So I think if you had a society that had like an aristocracy or a caste system or slavery or whatever, but then the slaves or the lower class or whatever still get to vote, and they just vote to keep that in place, it's hard for me to not look at that and think that is still a democracy, but it's a democracy in which people are subject to the law very unequally, even if they have equal power over it.
I think I actually agree. I actually agree. That's just, I think we've talked about this many times. It's so important not to just wield words and not and never go into the explanation. Most of the time when you say democracy, people are going to know what you mean. But occasionally, some people might be unclearly thinking democracy is good, and in this scenario, it might make sense to be like, no, well, sometimes democracy can be bad. This is a demonstration of which, technically speaking, the citizens, the people do have great representation. It's just that who gets that representation in the first place is a question that people disagree about.
Well, and equality also is a word with a lot of ambiguity to it, right? You could mean equality in many, many different ways. It's just like in any sense in which people are treated differently from one another, that's a break with equality. But obviously, we don't want, we are different people. We don't need to be treated exactly identically under all circumstances. That like we don't let 5-year-olds drive or whatever.
Yeah.
And that is a break with equality. But I don't know. It's like it seems like when people talk about political theory, they'll a lot of times say equality, the kind of taking for granted that it just means this whole range of things that like only some of which actually apply to the argument that they're making. I think that's what this guy's doing here, right?
Yeah, sort of. Yeah, actually, I think so.
Because if you're gonna say a society that is less equal is also less democratic, which I'm paraphrasing him, but that's roughly what he said, right?
Yeah.
It's just that can make a lot of sense depending on exactly what he means by equality, but not necessarily always going to be true. I think I would agree that on average it seems true, but yeah.
Assembly, the Council of 500, and the law courts. Its few elected officials were heavily constrained in their power, subject to the law, and supervised by the people. It's hard to imagine a society where the people have greater control over the institutions of their government. So in that way, Athens was
the people asterisk, not slaves.
was highly democratic, even purely democratic.
Also, wait, actually, what women too? I think did he ever explicitly say whether or not women had? I know he mentioned the thing that women were meant for control. I know he mentioned that, but did he actually give an explicit answer that women weren't allowed to be in the assembly?
Yeah. They did say that women were not allowed to be in this.
Yeah. Okay. Another really big asterisk.
Yes.
The people, not slaves, not women.
Democratic. But who are the people? In Athens,
Well,
only
shit.
adult men, free citizens had
God
political
damn
rights.
it.
So that's only around 10 or 20% of the
Shit.
population.
Can we pause again for a
So
second?
that means that between 80 and
This reminds me of like I was watching you stream like a few days ago or last week or something, and you were going over the Alex Jones thing where he was talking about the way that social media is governed, and he said like I don't think they should get to decide. I think we should get to decide because who decides who they are? And then he just says we without explaining who we are or who gets to decide with that. You know what I mean? It's like I feel like this is the same concept that's being addressed in this video here. It's just.
Yeah, you have to be really careful with the. It's a lot like selective skepticism. Selective skepticism is selective skepticism, but of a very specific variety.
Yeah, anyway, like I tend to think we just means whoever he sees as his in-group, right, is effectively what that's...
The good guys. No, but Cricket, his in-group are the good guys, though, so it's all right.
I forgot. Sorry, right.
Yeah,
and I'm sure that in
good.
ancient Athens, the white male non-slave, Greek citizens, or, I'm sure those were the good guys, too, and everybody else was an evil barbarian.
Listen, the women, they aren't sending their best. That's all I gotta say.
Yeah.
When it came to Athens, all right? Those Athenian women, all right? Don't judge it until you've seen it.
90% of the Athenian population didn't have access to political privileges. If you could just parse that sentence, that pretty much tells the story. So Athenian democracy was both remarkably thorough and remarkably narrow. It was thorough in the amount of control that the people had over the government, and narrow in the amount of people enjoying those privileges. You also have to remember that those exclusions were normal for the time, so you have to take historical context into account. If that society existed today, it'd be more controversial to call it democratic. But as it stands, it was an ancient society. Since their control over government was so thorough, and their exclusions were normal for the time, I think it's safe to call ancient Athens democratic. America is basically the opposite.
I think
story.
Athens actually
American
might be
democracy
kind of
began.
Well, for a second I was going to say maybe they actually, or the society that I was hypothetically talking about earlier, where they have like broad democratic control, but people are not treated equally under the law. But actually, like, if 90% of the society doesn't even participate in the democratic control over the law either, then I guess they're not actually the... Yeah.
As a limited democracy, similar to the democracy under Cleisthenes, if you remember him. As I described over the last third of this video, the control that the American people had over their government from the beginning was partial, mostly just in the form of elections of representatives. The people who held those privileges in the beginning was, like Athens, a narrow band of people, white, male property holders. So given that, I think early American democracy was at best a limited democracy. The controls over government were too partial, and there was too much political inequality. There were too many groups being excluded from politics. The limitations on the public's ability to control their government that I described in this video all still exist. So the American public's ability to control their government is still, at best, partial. In some ways, it's become even more limited. For example, with the rise of institutions like the CIA and the FBI, which are effectively outside of the public's control. But the scope of people included in American politics has significantly expanded over the last, say, 200 years. Propertyless people, women, and slaves were all seen as dependents in early America, and therefore unworthy of political privileges. After a civil war and a string of civil rights movements, virtually all adult citizens in America now formally have equal political rights. Only a few exclusions still stand.
The thing is, though, even that statement, setting aside the exclusions you're about to talk about, all adult citizens, to some people, I would agree. I don't think that children or non-citizens should be allowed to vote. But to some people, that might be just as controversial and wrong as the idea that, you know, black people or women should be allowed to vote. So even there, you know, even if we're going to acknowledge, oh yes, no, it is okay, right? We do still believe these things. It's also important to acknowledge that there is sort of that same sort of criticism and grounding can be made for us.
Yeah, like excluding children from voting probably does make sense, but it is less democratic than a society that did allow them to vote.
Yeah, exactly.
Like non-citizens and children and criminals in some circumstances. So the people in America is now realized about as broadly as it's been at anywhere at any time. But their ability to control the government is limited in that it mainly rests on elections. To make a judgment, I think America is a democracy. The ability to hire and dismiss your policymakers and your leaders is a powerful one. It's arguably the most powerful one, short of private citizens directly setting policy themselves. But the power of the public is limited enough to make me roughly agree with the democracy theorist Robert Dahl when he said that he believed that Madison went about as far as it's possible to go while still remaining in the rubric of democracy, which is to say that American institutions are about as undemocratic as they can be while still deserving the name. I think many hear that and automatically condemn the United States. But I think it's important to say, as a last note, that that's not necessarily the case. Democracy isn't a concept that has to be maximized at all times and under all circumstances.
Oh shit, you
not
really got us.
That the more democracy we have, the more fully we're able to realize a democracy, the better off we are. So it could be that more democracy would be good for America, but also maybe not. So think for yourself. That's it for me today. Thank you very much for watching. And
you can't tell me what to do.
Yeah, how undemocratic of it. There we go. That was Democracy from Antiquity to Modernity by Ryan Chapman. Oh, I thought this was part of like Vice or something. Never mind.
Yeah, this is good. This guy's just a video essayist that I came across recently. A friend of mine brought him to my attention.
Right on.
Yeah, so he actually did go into a lot of the stuff that you were hoping that he would go into.
A lot of our criticisms are feeling a little dumb now,
Yeah.
but you know what? Respect. Yeah, I thought he actually had quite the good take by the end.
Yeah, I mean, it was a little bit to my surprise that he did it the way that he did. Um, yeah, I don't know. Do you have anything else you want to add about it?
No, I mean, I think he hit the nail on the head. Democracy is really important, but it is not the only thing that's really important. So sometimes it makes sense for us to, you know, limit that, but it is still important when you do so to realize that, limiting it is a big step. And sometimes, it's not something that should be done lightly. You need a really good reason. So, for example, I think we have really good reason to be like, children probably shouldn't be able to vote. But whenever you do so, you can do it. You just got to be really careful.
And this guy Brian Chapman did touch on a couple of the downsides of democracy, right?
Yep.
People not necessarily having the kind of academic competence to deal with certain types of questions that ordinary people don't have a lot of information about. Like they just so like some things might be better handled by experts. That's one.
Yep.
Another one is the whole tyranny of the majority concept, right? The whole like two wolves and a sheep voting on what's for dinner, like that concept, right? Yep. Yeah, I don't know. I guess that's about all I've got. So I'm gonna go ahead and just raid into you, and
Right on.
yeah, I'll see you around. Thanks for joining me. Have a good week.
Yeah, you too, Ben.